Hi, how are y'all? Thanks for coming out today. Appreciate you coming out, listening to me. This is a presentation that I normally would do like in at least half a day's time, so I'm gonna try and condense it down into a couple of hours. So when I'm supposed to stand in the light, sorry. I'm gonna try and condense it down to a couple of hours, and so we're gonna move quickly. So anyway, we're gonna be talking about exposure and white balance today. And just to tell you a little bit about who I am, what my background is, maybe you know who Doug Jensen is, maybe you don't, but I've been in the business about 35 years or so. Started as a production company owner, went to freelance director of photography. I've worked in news, I've worked in sports, live sports, I've worked in, I've produced, I direct, I do everything. So I like to wear a lot of different hats, and I've got a lot of experience in the business. Lately, I've evolved into doing a lot more instructing, teaching classes around the country, particularly for Sony on their camcorders, teaching classes up at Main Media Workshops, if you're familiar with that. And I also produce my own training videos and stuff. I have a couple of videos on interview lighting and videos on specific Sony camcorders and a book on the FS7. And that's the camera we're going to be using today a little bit, is the FS7. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, they're all available at B&H. So our topic today is, I want to get right into this because we've got a lot of ground to cover, is white balance and exposure. First of all, why are they so important? Why are we even sitting here talking about white balance and exposure? Well, when you think about it, when you think about what you're shooting, and a lot of the stuff today I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be sort of in the realm of doing interviews and headshots and that kind of stuff. And if you're a professional in the business, you know that there's lots of things you need to shoot. But to me, the core part of documentaries, news, corporate video is lighting people's faces, interviews, headshots, that sort of thing. So most of what I talk about today is going to be geared with that kind of a shooting scenario in mind. And when you think about that, there's really four main components of image quality. There's white balance, focus, exposure, and composition. Pretty much everything about the camera and what you shoot falls into those categories. We're not going to talk about focus and composition today. We're going to focus on white balance and exposure. So what do they have in common? Well, they're both difficult to fix in post. They can be fixed in post, but it's time consuming and not ideal. So if we can get those right out at the time of shooting, then we're better off. And it's easy to get both of those right out at the time of shooting. That's kind of if you take away one thing for this whole thing, it's easy to take manual control of white balance and exposure while you're shooting. It's not the mystery or the hassle that some people think it's going to be if they're used to shooting on automatic. Because we can't leave those settings on automatic if we want optimal images. Can't leave those on automatic. And I'll be talking about quite a bit today why automatic is not the way to go for either white balance or exposure. So here's some frame grabs that I got off of TV. These are not my interviews. These are things that I got off of TV. Network television. It's too easy to pick apart local news and that sort of thing. So I try to, when I'm doing presentations, try and grab stuff that people in the business thought were good enough to go on network television. Here's the problems that I see with these pictures. You probably already picked up on some of these as soon as the slide came up. The gentleman up there in the upper left, his head's overexposed. We got a really bad white balance on the guy up in the upper right. He's very pale, almost looks like a cadaver. And look at the guy in the lower right. He's overexposed and the white balance isn't very good. We've got the guy in the left there. His face isn't too bad, but look at his clothing. Look at the white. With all the material on his white, or not all of it, but there's some good highlights on his white clothing there that's clipped. And with today's cameras, such as the FS7, or I don't care if you're talking about other Sony cameras or Canon cameras, Panasonic, whatever, the technology of the cameras has evolved to the point that today, there's really no excuse for having clipped highlights anymore. 20 years ago with a Betacam or some other camera, okay, maybe clipped highlights you had to accept. Remember, if anybody's been in the business for a while knows that you used to tell people, you can wear whatever you want, but don't wear white, to the interview or whatever. That was kind of a no-no. We've passed that point where that's not an issue. So clipped highlights, we shouldn't have to settle for those anymore, especially on an interview setup where it's controlled lighting. But clipped highlights aren't only in an interview situation. I don't want clipped highlights when I'm out shooting landscapes or nature stuff either. The highlights and the clouds there are clipped. There's no detail in some of those bright white clouds. That's unacceptable. This is more kind of the interview stuff that I'm looking for. I'm looking for stuff where the white balance is a little bit nicer looking on the face, they have healthier skin tones, and the exposure is right on the money. There's a very narrow range that I would consider to be a correct exposure. You'll find out. You know, if you open up the iris just a little bit more, it's overexposed. If you close it down a little bit more, it's a little bit underexposed. It's like focus. Something's either in focus or it is not in focus. And I feel that way about exposure also. Either it's exposed correctly or it's not exposed correctly. There's a very narrow gray area there. So let's begin. First half here, we're going to talk about white balance. Then we'll get to exposure in the second half. So we're going to kind of divide those two out. And I like to do white balance first because if you were setting up to do an interview or something like that, white balance is probably that's the thing that you would set first and get that taken care of, and then you do it worry about exposure. So it's kind of doing it in the order that we do on a real shoot. Let's start right at the beginning. What is white balance? Well, white balance is the setting on your camera that defines how the color white should look, and white is a color. And if white looks right, all the rest of the colors are going to look correct. And that's basically what white balance is. If we make white look good, all the other colors should fall into place. Now, some people say, well, isn't white white? I mean, white is white. No, it's not. White depends on the color of light that's striking it. The lights that are coming down on me right now are a certain color temperature. They're lighting me up. I would look different to your eyes if we changed lights and went to tungsten instead of these LEDs, or yeah, LEDs they are. Daylight balanced LEDs it looks like. So the light that hits the white is dependent upon the color temperature of the light that's striking it. What is color temperature? Well, color temperature is the measure of a light source's color. So different types of lights have different colors to them. For instance, you've probably seen scales like this before, charts that show relative color temperature of different various light sources. Down at the bottom, very warm light would be candles or flames, that sort of thing. Moving up from there, we come to the tungsten lights, which are getting, you know, the light bulbs in your house, which are getting harder to find these days, obviously, since they've been outlawed. But that's sort of around a 3,200 degree color temperature. We move up to daylight sun, that comes in around 5,600, maybe up to 6,000. Then if it's an overcast day, the color temperature goes up a little bit higher, has more of a bluish, cooler look to it. If we go to a full cloudy day, that's even more blue than the rest. So as you can see, different light sources have different color temperatures. But we don't really see that much ourselves because our eyes adjust for that automatically. If you stop and think about it, yes, you can see different color temperatures from different light sources, but generally just in the day-to-day living, our eyes adjust automatically and we don't really see those differences. But the cameras are not that smart. Even a nice camera here, very sophisticated camera, a 4K camcorder like the Sony FS7, even this camera and ones that are even more expensive than this one are not that smart. They can't tell what color, what white, and therefore all the other colors in the spectrum are supposed to look like. We have to help the camera do that. That's part of our job as a video professional, is to help the camera do that. So as we talk about white balance, let's think about some goals that we want to make, that we want to do while we're worried about white balance. One, we want natural looking colors. We don't want stuff that looks, you've all seen it probably, maybe you've experienced this yourself, maybe you've seen it on other people's video or on the news or something, where someone white balances indoors and they go outside and they don't change the white balance and now everything's too blue, or just the opposite, they come in and everything's too orange or something. So we want natural looking colors, obviously. We want to override the camera's default tones, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Most professional video cameras are, their white balance is a little too cool. We want healthy skin tones. That's one of our major goals, especially if we're doing interviews and people. We want nice, healthy skin tones. We want to capture colors that are consistent from shot to shot. For instance, if I'm doing if I'm shooting a video here and I've got a wide shot over here, and then I come over here for a close-up on this gentleman here or something, I don't want my colors changing between those two shots. Whatever white balance I've decided that I want to have, I want to make sure they're consistent when I have to cut together a sequence. And I don't want to change within the shot either. A common problem that I see is, someone will put the camera on automatic or something, and the camera will pan over, or something in the shot will change, and the white balance changes too, because the camera detects that there's been a change in color temperature, and so it automatically wants to compensate. So we want to prevent the camera from changing stuff within a shot. So that second to last bullet point there is, we want consistent colors from shot to shot, but then within each individual shot, we don't want the colors fluctuating either. And we want to be creative with the white balance. White balance is not something where this is the white balance and that must be the white balance. There is, unlike exposure, there is a wide margin of what looks good to some people and what doesn't look good to other people. Maybe sometimes I want to have a cooler white balance. Maybe sometimes I want to have a warmer white balance. Those are creative decisions that you get to make. For instance, here we saw the guy there on the left earlier. I think a lot of things wrong with that shot, really, from a lighting standpoint and things. But he does not look healthy. I don't think those are healthy skin tones. I prefer the guy on the right. You may not, and that's fine. You may say, that's a little too warm for me, or that's not warm enough. That's cool, because, no, that's not cool. I gotta be careful with my terminology, I'll get you all confused. That is okay, because what looks good to you may not look good to me. That's where we get into the creative side of it, is you being able to control the look that you want. I like the look on his right, but you don't have to agree with that. Another example here, I like the guy on the left for my interview rather than the guy on the right. Even if you ignore the exposure problems that guy's got, just from the white balance standpoint, he does not look good. So what are the methods of white balancing? How do we white balance the camera? I'm going to run through the list first, and then we'll go back and we'll talk about each one of them in detail. But let's just list them out first so we kind of have a roadmap of where we're going for the next few minutes. Every camera that I'm aware of, unless you get to the very high levels of cameras, has an automatic white balance. On Sony cameras, sometimes they call that ATW. But automatic white balance is basically, you're taking a professional camcorder and you're going to treat it like a consumer camcorder, where you just flip the button into auto and you say, I'm going to shoot, and let the camera worry about it. Preset, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, where we put the white balance into the ballpark range of where we want to shoot. You can also go into the camera and dial in a color temperature manually. We'll talk more about that. And you can also set a white balance manually using a white card or some other target that you want a white balance on. We're going to cover all four of those in detail. So let's start with automatic. First of all, what are the pros and cons with automatic? I think I've probably already given you a hint of what some of the pros and cons are. Let's go through them. Really, there's only one pro. It's easy. I come over to the camera, I flip the switch, either the white balance switch here to auto, or I put it on the camera on full auto, and then it's doing white balance, exposure, everything is on automatic. And that's really the only pro. There's nothing else good about automatic white balance, except simply that it's easy. But there are many cons. First of all, it's not very accurate, because the camera doesn't know, as we talked about before, doesn't know what you are shooting. So the camera has to figure out, oh, that's a white car, not a red car, or that's a white wall, that's an off-white wall or bone-colored wall, not a pure white wall, whatever's in the shot. So the camera has to do a lot of thinking and guessing about what the white balance should be, and the camera is not going to be that accurate. Sometimes, I will concede that the cameras do a pretty good job for what they are. It's amazing the technology that they can build into the cameras, and they do better than sometimes I give them credit for. But still, from a professional standpoint, and that's what we're talking about, from a professional standpoint, they're not very accurate. Also, as I talked about before, you risk the fluctuation, because when the camera's on automatic, it's always evaluating the scene. It always looking at stuff, so it risks changing right in the middle of the shot. If you put the camera on automatic, almost every camera, especially the Sony cameras, and those are the ones that I'm most familiar with, are going to be too cool. So we looked at some of the other examples there of some of the white balances on the faces and stuff. Those are too cool, and a great big cause of that is if people put the white balance on automatic, the camera is going to choose white balance that is too cool. And we have no creative control this way either. So if we want warmer skin tones, if we want a different look, we can't do that with automatic really. And when we get into editing, we're much more likely to have issues or problems that are going to need to be fixed in post. Maybe big problems, maybe just little problems, just kind of evening everything out. But if we do it in camera, we avoid all of that. So those are the cons of automatic. So we'll take a step up from there, and we'll come up to preset white balance. Preset white balance allows us to designate put the color temperature of the camera into a ballpark range of the environment that we're shooting at. If you remember film from the olden days, you bought daylight balanced film, you bought indoor film, and that was kind of like buying a preset film. So presets on the camera are much like putting an indoor film into your old film camera or an outdoor film. You're telling the camera, I am shooting indoors, I am shooting outdoors, or there's other variations also. And so you're helping the camera at least figure out, okay, what environment am I shooting? Because the camera doesn't know if you're indoors or outdoors, it's just looking at a bunch of pixels. On an SLR, you would have settings called daylight, shade, fluorescent. Those are all presets, preset white balances. But professional video cameras don't have those kind of preset white balances. But it does have preset on it. There's right here on the white balance switch, we can flip that down to P, and now the camera is on preset. Well, what is that preset going to be? Well, a professional video camera has a menu on it someplace where you can go in and tell it what you want your color temperature to be preset at. In this case, it's 5,681 degrees Kelvin, which is pretty much an outdoor white balance on it. But I could roll that down to 3,200 or up to a higher number, 8,000, 10,000. There's a wide range of how far you can take that white balance. So if you're going to use preset, you kind of have to give some thought, well, what is my with a professional video camera, you have to kind of give some thought as to where am I, what is my shooting environment, because you obviously don't want to use a 3200 preset, which is tungsten lighting, very warm, in an outdoor situation. So you've got to use some brains if you're going to use preset. It puts colors in the right ballpark. So if we're shooting outdoors, we tell the camera we want an outdoor preset, at least we've told it that, and so maybe it'll get better colors that way. It reduces the chances of fluctuation because now the camera isn't running on automatic where it can adjust the white balance anywhere it wants to. We've told the camera, this is our white balance. Whatever that number is, stay there. So we reduce the risk of fluctuations. And preset is actually the best mode to use outdoors. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. The cons, it's not based on actual lighting conditions. It's just kind of a number that I'm selecting, I'm dialing in. So if I tell it, 3,200, I'm going to go with preset. I'm going to dial in for 3,200. And I shoot here in this environment, my white balance is going to be way off because these are not 3,200 degree lights. These are probably 5,600 or 5,000 or something like that. So you have to be, so the white balance is not, or if we go out there in the showroom, that's a totally different color temperature out there too. So if you choose a preset white balance, it may or may not be right because it's not based on the actual lighting. Very little creative control. Yes, you can dial in that 5,600 or 5,800 or something. So you have a little bit more creative control than you would with automatic, but you still don't have any really way to fine tune that color very easily. And there's no consistency between different camera models. Let's say we're doing a multi-camera shoot. We've got an FS7 here and maybe a Canon C300 over there, or maybe we've got an SLR that we're going to use as our second mode. If we put all the cameras on daylight white balance, they're not going to match because daylight white balance to each of those cameras is going to be a different color. So if you're mixing cameras, it's not a very consistent way of doing it. Here's a quick tip. I have a few of these coming up. Just these are the bullet points, the things that you really need to take away from here. Avoid using preset under artificial lighting. And why do we want to avoid using preset under artificial lighting? Because man-made lighting comes in all colors and color temperatures and styles. There's no regularity to it. Like I said, I have no idea what the color temperature is outside there, out in the B&H showroom there. And I think this is probably 5,000. If I went outside, who knows what that is. So, well, not outside because we're talking about man-made lighting, but all man-made lighting is different. So if you're going to say, well, this is why is a personal pet peeve of mine, people just go to, well, I'm shooting indoors, so I'll use a 3200K indoor white balance. Well, how do you know that your lighting is 3200 tungsten indoors? That is becoming more and more rare, and in many scenarios, you've actually got a mixed lighting situation anyway. So under man-made lighting, don't use preset. But the flip side is that preset works great outdoors. Preset is a fantastic way of shooting outdoors. What you want to do with outdoor shooting is you don't want to allow the white balance to neutralize the natural colors of the day. This is something that some people have a little trouble getting a concept of. Indoors, we don't know what the lighting is, we don't know what the color temperature is, so we need to white balance to put the camera so that it matches the lighting. Outdoors, the sun never changes. The sun is always the sun. It's a bright, burning orb 94 million miles away, and it's the same every day, even at night. It's the same, you just can't see it. Now the weather changes, and the time of day changes, and we know that that causes changes to outdoor lighting. A sunset obviously has warmer light than if we go outside at midday here in Manhattan, right? And a cloudy day has a cooler, bluer look to it than a bright sunny day. So yes, there are some differences based on time of day, location, weather, but we don't want to cancel those out. If we were to take the camera and we were to put it on preset, or we were to, as we're going to cover in a minute, how to do a manual white balance, a custom manual white balance, if we were to do that outside at sunset, we'd take all the color out of the sunset and just have a neutral looking thing. Some shots are supposed to look warm. We don't want to neutralize that and make everything look the same medium gray, if you want to call it that. Some shots are supposed to look cool. So outdoors, I never white balance the camera. My personal technique is to never white balance the camera outdoors during daylight. If the sun is the light source, I don't care if it's cloudy, I don't care if it's rainy, I don't care what it is, I do not white balance the camera outdoors. I use an outdoor preset, which depending on the camera that I've got, is usually between 5,600 and 6,000 degrees Kelvin. I dial that in on the camera for my preset, and I'm good to go for outdoor shooting. So speaking of dialing in a white balance, that's another technique that some people like to use, is just to say, well, I'm not going to put it on preset. I'm just going to dial in a number onto the menu. You open the camera's menu, you go to color, we put it on memory A, and we go to the menu and we just dial in whatever number we want. Oh, I want a warmer look, I want a cooler look, okay? That's one way of white balancing. Not a way that I would recommend though. The pro is that it's a familiar technique for SLR shooters. A lot of people have come into the business not coming from a professional video background or from shooting with beta cams or those kind of cameras in coming up as I did, people my age and stuff. A lot of people jump in, they start with SLRs and stuff, and an SLR is difficult to white balance. I mean, we're talking about professional video cameras here. When you move from an SLR, when you're ready to upgrade to a regular video camera, you don't want to just be dialing in a white balance just by going to the menu and doing it that way. But that is a familiar way for people that are used to doing it that way. They can continue to do that with the video camera, but I wouldn't recommend it for a couple of reasons. First of all, once again, you're not dialing it in based on actual lighting conditions. You're just guessing based on your eyeballs. Okay, I'll dial in, I'll choose I'll choose 3,200, I'll choose 4,000, something like that. You're just guessing. And when you're guessing, how are you judging those colors? That's the big question. because the viewfinder or the LCD monitor on any video camera, I don't care which video camera you want to go out there in the showroom and bring in, they are not good enough to make those kind of critical decisions on, to be able to look at that little LCD viewfinder and say, a little bit more, a little warmer, a little cooler, a little more green or whatever. You can't expect a camera like that to replace a full-blown color grading suite. And that's really what you're doing. Anybody who looks at the camera says, yeah, I'll just dial it in, just dial it in. You're basically saying that your little menu, your couple of menus on the camera, and judging by that LCD replaces all that, because now you're color grading out in the field. Highly advise you not to do that, because your eyes can be fooled too easily by the ambient lighting conditions where you're at. If you take some gel and hold that up in front, take a blue gel, hold it up in front of your eyes for a while, and then take it away, everything's going to look a funny color, right? You've all done that at some point or another, because as we talked about before, your eyes adapt for different color changes. So if you're trying to make color decisions in a non-ideal circumstances, who knows what you're really going to get. Now, if you've got a really good broadcast monitor and it's set up to color bars and it's perfectly calibrated and you've got ideal viewing conditions, sure, you can probably use that then to dial in a color on the camera if you want to. But that's not really a practical answer for shooting in different environments. I mean, not many of us have the luxury of bringing along a high quality monitor like that to judge colors by. And there's no need to, as we'll see. There's no need to go to that trouble. You might want to have a monitor for other reasons, but I wouldn't recommend grading your camera from a monitor on location. It's a waste of time also. So how are we judging the colors? We don't know. And something that a lot of people forget about is, what about the magenta green axis? We talk a lot about warmer and cooler, but what about magenta and green? That's a very important component of white balance that people totally ignore sometimes. So here we've got a representation of a vector scope. If this was an all-day class, I'd bring my vector scope in and we'd come up and we'd look at it and I'd show you how to read a vector scope and stuff. But for this class, we're just going to kind of gloss over that. But this is a vector scope, and just to help you picture more of what a vector scope shows you, I've overlaid a color wheel onto it so you can see that blue is over there to the 4 o'clock position, yellow is up more around the 10 o'clock position. And when you go into the menus on a camera and you're going to dial in a white balance, most cameras only give you a menu control to go between warmer and cooler. For example, here on the FS7, go to color temp A, we can roll that number, that 51, 55 number up. We can make it warmer by going to a higher number. We can make it cooler to go to a lower number. But that's only one component of the color. So if we roll the menu, there's our little point with this, say that's little round dot is our white balance. Well, then we just made it, we just saw in the animation there, we just went from cooler to warmer. So we've got a warmer picture, and that's great if the white balance is already neutral for the other colors. But what if we have a situation, what about all the other colors in the rainbow? What if our white balance is too green? Now, how is adjusting the warmer and cooler axis going to compensate for that green that's too green? Say we're out here shooting under these fluorescent lights out in the showroom. Those look like industrial fluorescent lights that have a green tint to them. If we just dial in a warmer or cooler number, how are we going to compensate for that? Well, some cameras do have a warm green axis that will let you go and change that axis. And if it does, then that's great. But now we're back to the question of, all right, do I have a monitor that I can trust, that I can make these adjustments and know that I'm dialing out the right amount of green? So magenta green, we want to make sure we have a thing for that. So if you're going to dial in a white balance, make sure you've got a magenta green, sometimes called tint, and you can adjust that axis also. Finally, we come to custom white balance. And the way I've trashed all these other ways, you probably figure, oh, this must be the one that he likes here, right? Okay, all right, yes, it is the one that I like. I like preset outdoors, but for indoor lighting, we need to do, not just indoors, anytime you're under man-made artificial lighting, we need to do a custom white balance, which is super fast and easy to do. Let's talk about what the camera does when we do a manual white balance. Basically, We need to use a white target. We're going to aim the camera at a white target. We're going to say, this is what white should look like. So whether that's a sun shining on the card, or a candle, or a fire, or a tungsten light, or a fluorescent light, whatever it is, whatever is reflecting off of that card and bouncing back to the camera, we're going to tell the camera, that's what white should look like. So this is what the camera might see before we white balance. And at first you might think, well, that's white. Okay, so maybe we're good to go already. But that's not white. Here's a patch of what white really looks like. So how many people kind of felt like that looked white when it first came up? Okay, so it was not white, and that's why I'm talking about you can't trust your eyes a little bit. And you know, I'm not really trying to fool anybody with that, because I think, you know, it is quite off the wall, their color. But you know that I'm probably going to throw something like that. If you're out in a shoot and you're just going along, you're not even going to be looking at stuff that carefully. So that's what white's supposed to look like. That's what the camera sees. If we continued to shoot there, we'd have awful skin tones if we assume that the camera was already white balanced. So here we come back to a representation of a vector scope. My experience, and I'm sure there's other people here in the room who have used a vector scope, can look at that vector scope and I can tell pretty much what the camera is shooting. That camera is shooting because the vectors aren't going all over the place. I can tell there's really no color in this shot except for blue. So I can pretty much tell that is a representation of the camera shooting a card under blue lighting, or it's a blue card. You know, but if the camera is aimed at a white target, I can tell that has too much blue in it. Because when we set the camera, we aim it at the card, which we're going to do a little bit later. We push the white balance button. That vector that was jumping, that trace on the vector that was shooting out, telling us we had too much blue, is now to the center. That's what we want to see on a vector scope when a camera is aimed at a white target and it is properly white balance. There's no offshoots of different colors. There's no tinting. That is a pure perfect white balance right there. So if we had a vector scope with us, which we don't need to take a vector scope with us out on location, but if we did, that's what we would see when the camera was correctly white balanced. So going back to our card there, we've got a white card. That was before the white balance. Now we've aimed the camera and says, that's a white card, make it white. And so the camera says, okay, well, if that card is supposed to be white, then I'm going to subtract all these extraneous colors that are falling from our lights, and the card becomes white. And if white looks white, then all the other colors are going to look correct also. So here's a couple of examples. And it's easier to show examples on these slides than it is to turn on the camera and start setting up lights and all that kind of stuff. That takes a lot of time, and this is much easier to see, so I prefer to do it this way today. So before white balancing, things are a little bit blue. After, they're looking more normal. We get into some people. Before we white balance, she didn't look that good. Some people might say she looked okay, but after, I think we can see that looks better. So, but there are some pros and cons with custom, just like the others. The pros are that it's based on the precise lighting conditions. It doesn't matter. I don't have to know what these lights are. I don't have to know what those lights are out in the showroom. All I have to know is that I'm going to take a card. I'm going to hold that up in front of the camera. I'm going to say, that is white. It doesn't even have to be a white card here if you're just going to do a regular, right? It could be a piece of paper. Typing paper works okay for it if you're just going to do a regular white target. Anybody who has porta-brace cases for their camera, they usually include a plastic white card in there. Those are all good white targets to use if you just want to do a straight, regular, custom white balance. But important thing is that it's almost like using the eyedropper tool in Photoshop to point using the camera as an eyedropper tool to point the camera at white and say, sample that color, make that white. A color monitor or viewfinder isn't necessary because I'm not really making any judgments about the color. I'm just going to hold out this white card or have the talent hold it up. I'm going to hit white balance. And it's going to look at that white and it's going to white balance. I don't need a color monitor. I don't need a color viewfinder. In fact, if I had my druthers, I'd rather have a higher resolution viewfinder on a camera and have black and white higher resolution, like the old Betacam cameras that those of my age group grew up on. I'd rather have a higher resolution black and white one than a color LCD if I had my choices, because I don't need to see color. I'm not making any color decisions out in the field. Con, requires just a little bit more effort compared to putting it on auto. Put it on auto, you just push the button and you start shooting. If you want to do daylight, or preset. Preset, you've got to stop. You basically just choose, dial in a number and you're off and running. With manual white balance, you are going to have to take a white card or some sort of white target, hold that up there under the lighting that you're shooting at, and actually white balance the camera. It takes an extra 15 or 20 seconds. So it does a little bit of effort, but not much. And if the lighting changes, then it has to be repeated. If we're shooting here, we white balance. Now we're going to go out there in the showroom where I can see just to my eyes that's a totally different color temperature out there. We're going to have to stop and re-white balance out there. Or if we're doing interviews in a corporate situation, we're in the first person's office and we go down to this other woman and we interview her in her office. It's a different type of lighting or something. We're going out on the factory floor. Every time you change locations or the lighting changes significantly, you're going to have to stop and repeat the white balance. It's not uncommon to have to white balance in those kind of situations, a dozen times a day. I'm sure I've white balanced many times, more than a dozen times a day in a single day. But you get in the habit of it, it's no big deal. It takes you 15 seconds, it's easy, but it is a con. And as I talked about before, it will neutralize your outdoor colors, which is why I don't use custom white balance outdoors, because I don't want to neutralize those natural colors that we get. Sometimes the daylight, particularly in the late evening, early morning, it's going to be a warmer light. If it's cloudy, it's going to be a little bit cooler. I don't want to neutralize those things out. I want my outdoor stuff to look natural, like it did to my eyes. And so if you white balance, you're going to neutralize those colors. So here's how we do white balancing step by step. Don't really have the ability right now to put the camera up on the screen very easily, and so I'm just going to lead you through the steps, and we're not going to do a real white balance right now. After the thing is over, anybody wants to come up, happy to turn on the lights that we've got here, and we'll do some real white balancing if you want to. But for the purposes of the presentation, to stay on track, we're just going to, I'm just going to talk about it, and we can do the work. We can work through it later if anybody's interested. So, more important to focus on the steps rather than any results we're going to get here, because obviously we're not going to do a big lighting setup. It's not going to look great. Number one, finalize your lighting first. Because if you start dimming lights or changing lights or moving things around, then the mix of ambient light, maybe if you've got a colored wall here, it's reflecting, there's bounce all over the place from when you're shooting in a room. There's light bouncing all over from people's clothing, from the ceiling, from the carpet on the floor. So you want to finalize your lighting first before you white balance. Then, every professional camera that I'm aware of has a switch on it for A/B memory. So we would want to choose A or B. And right here, I'll just pretend that we're setting that one for A, memory A. Then we're going to place our white card near the subject. So if we were going to interview her, we would have her hold the white card there and we would zoom in on the white card. We don't want to white balance over here because our lighting is probably focused here. The lighting here may not be the same over there, so you want to make sure that that card is being held where the focus, where the subject is going to be. And this is why white balancing, you see in SLR stuff, people will have little plastic covers that they put over their, over their lens and white balance through like a white lens cap kind of a looking thing, or maybe it's a honeycomb kind of shape. Well, that works okay if you're outdoors, but it's a terrible idea if you're shooting, let's say, an interview. Because if we're lit up and doing an interview properly, our light is different over here than it is over here. We've lit our circle of light there where the subject is sitting, and if we white balance with some sort of a cover here, that's not the same as white balancing on the card that's over there under the light. So we're going to want to zoom in and fill that card with the frame, with the camera as much as we can. And different cameras have different tolerances for how much you have to fill that frame. But when in doubt, fill 100% of the frame with the card if you can. With Sony cameras, usually 80% is good enough. I'm not sure about other brands, but I personally try to do 100%. And that may be too far away for my lens to zoom in. I mean, now a lot of us are shooting with cameras like this one. This is only a 3x lens. It goes from 50 to 150 millimeters. It's not like the old cameras that we used to use, where it was a 20x lens or something, where I could really zoom in right in that card. So you may have to physically pick the camera up, white balance on the card, and then move it back. That's just a fact of life that we have to deal with now that we've moved to cameras that have big sensors and lenses that don't have the same amount of zoom range. So when I'm setting up my lighting and stuff, I make sure to leave a little path here that I can move in a little bit if I need to get my white balance and then come out. But if you can't zoom in and fill that card, don't take the card and do your white balance here because you couldn't zoom in all the way, because this light here, chances are, is not the same as the light over there. And then this is the one time where I would say use auto iris. If your camera has auto exposure, put it on auto exposure just for a minute, or just dial down the iris if you want to do it manually. Either way is fine. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have this card really overexposed. If the card is too high, too overexposed, I mean, it doesn't have to be really what I would call overexposed. If it's just up to where you would normally want a white card to look like in your shot, the camera probably isn't going to get a good white balance. You want to have the white card exposed down around 50 or 60%. That's why automatic will work fine. If you have it really overexposed, the camera should give you an error warning and say white balance no good, too bright, or something like that. So dial it down. But I know the camera's going to tell me that, so I just automatically, when I have the white card held up over there, I dial it down a little bit, do my white balance, and then I put it back where I wanted it, the iris. That's why it's better to do your white balancing first before you worry about exposure, because in the course of white balancing, you're probably going to have to mess up your exposure anyway. So you might have your exposure perfectly set. Now we got to shoot this white card to get our white balance, and it may involve changing the exposure. Now you got to go and reset your exposure. So white balance first, then exposure. So once we've zoomed in on the white card, it's filled the frame, we've irised down, we push the white balance button here in the front. Different cameras have different buttons in different locations, but usually on Sony cameras, it's a button right here on the front. So we just push the button, and the camera will say, for about 5 seconds, processing, some sort of a processing message will come up, and after about 2 or 3 seconds, it'll say, white balance good. And now you're ready to shoot. That's it. So just to kind of condense that down, all that can be done in about 15 seconds. You finalize your lighting, you choose A or B, you have someone hold the white card, you iris down, push the button, you're done. So it's very quick, very easy. There's no reason really not to do a custom white balance under man-made lighting, so that you make sure that you're getting the exact right colors. Saves you a lot of time in post. But here's another tip for you, if it'll come up. White does not always need to look white. So we've talked about the technically accurate way to white balance. Now we'll talk about the creative and artistic way that we bring to white balancing. Because remember when we looked at some of those pictures before, that was the one on the left, that was before white balancing. After white balancing, we have her on the right. She looks a lot better on the right. I think everybody can probably agree with that. But neither one of those look good enough to me. I want her to have warmer skin tones than that. And the bottom one there in the middle, that's where the creative part of white balancing comes in. Just to repeat again, the left one before white balancing, the right one up at the top, that was after white balancing on a white card. The bottom one, that's where we've done something to change the white balance creatively to give us better skin tones. Almost all the cameras that I've used, if you white balance on a white card, yes, the colors are accurate, but I don't really want that accurate of colors. I want to go a little bit more creative. Again, white card and creative. White card and creative. I prefer the skin tones on the right. White card again and creative. And even outdoors. If I'm going to be, I need to back up a little bit on something, retract a little bit. If I'm shooting outdoors, if I'm shooting landscapes and that sort of stuff, city stuff, I don't white balance. I choose an outdoor preset. But if I'm going to be doing somebody's face, if I'm going to be doing an interview or something like that, then I will often cheat the white balance on something like that because I also want to bring warmer tones to that. So that's the one exception when I do possibly white balance outdoors, is when the principal subject is like a headshot interview like that. Warm cards, that's a product of Vortex Media, my company, and that is how I cheat white balance. And I'm not the only one, because we've been selling warm cards for about 15 years, since around 2000, 2001, I think it was. There are literally tens of thousands of them in use around the world. The B&H is a huge seller of warm cards, and they're all over the place. You'll find them being used on shows like 60 Minutes, Nova, Frontline, Dateline NBC, 2020, lots of corporate videos. NFL Films, I know, has several sets of them. And this is how professionals at that level cheat the white balance. There are other ways of doing it, but this is a nice, easy way that most people have adopted at that level. And white balance warm cards come in a canvas case like this. There are smaller cards that can be a little bit more portable, can go in your pocket or something. I don't use those myself too often, but I use the bigger cards. And basically it's a set of 16 cards, 8 small, 8 large. And each of the cards is a progressively different tone. And we white balance on one of these cards instead of using a white card. Now we're cheating the white balance, is how I like to put it, and telling the camera, we're going to tell the camera that a card that really isn't white is white, and then the camera will compensate and give us a different kind of color. For instance, if we look at this chart, the gray card in the kit is just slightly warmer than a real white. So if you just want something that's just slightly warmer, you can white balance on a gray card. Or you can go to a warm 1, warm 2, warm 3. You can see how they progressively step up to make the images warmer and warmer. And there's a couple of cool cards also, because there are some instances where maybe you want a cooler white balance for some creative reason. And minus green, people immediately who aren't familiar with warm cards want to know, what's a minus green for? Well, minus green is for if you're shooting in locations with a lot of cheap industrial fluorescent lighting. And I'm not talking about fluorescent lighting and professional lights that you would use. I'm talking about lights that are up in the troughs in the ceiling that you typically find at a school, a grocery store, a factory, those kind of places. Though most of those lights have a very strong green tint to them. And if you take a regular white card and you white balance under those whites, the camera generally does not have the power to neutralize all that green. So if you take a minus green card and you white balance under those kind of lights with the minus green card, it'll subtract that green out of the shot, and you'll end up with a much cleaner, whiter white balance than if you use white. So just real quickly, so that would be a white card on the left. You might look at that and say, that looks good. And it's okay, it's technically correct. It's set for the lighting where she was sitting. But the warm card on the warm card 1 on the right is more pleasing to me. Warm card 1 again on the right. To me, she has healthier, more vibrant skin tones than the one on the left. Now that's a warm card 2, so she's even a little bit warmer. We're using a stronger strength of warm card on that one. And if you say, well, that's a little bit more warm than I want to have, then you could dial it back and go with a warm 1. Now, how is this different than just dialing in the colors by just dialing in the colors? Well, the warm cards just aren't simply just a shade of blue. We've chosen these covers very carefully to also take into account the magenta green axis also, to make sure that the skin tones come out looking right. So if you just take just a blue piece of paper or something like that, or if you just go into the camera, you just say, I'm just going to dial it to a higher number, it's not the same thing as using a warm card, because you're not adjusting the magenta green axis. And also the advantages of the warm card is that I don't have to have a monitor. I'm not sitting here making decisions. Too warm, too cool, I don't know, okay, I guess that's good enough. I just have to take a warm card, just use it like a white card, zoom the camera in, hit the button, and I know exactly what a warm 2 is going to look like in my video without having a color monitor or even caring about that, because I've got the experience to know that what this card is going to do to my white balance. Well, pretty good. So that's our white balance section. Without further ado, let's move on to exposure, and we can come back to white balance later if we want to. So as we talked about at the beginning, exposure is very important. Here's the examples we saw at the beginning just to refresh your memory. We don't want clipped whites like we've got on his. His face looks okay, there's a guy on the left, but we've got clipped light whites on his clothing. That's unacceptable. The guy on the right there, he's way overexposed. That's not the way people's faces are supposed to look. So we want to avoid all that. Again, even on B-roll stuff, there's clipped highlights in his scarf, in that gentleman's hat, and his shirt back there, and the guy behind him. There are clipped highlights in those whites. And once white reaches a certain threshold, and you've got no more detail in it, that's basically what clipping is when the white gets so high, it kind of clips off. It's like in audio. Once the audio meter is pegged into the red, that's it. You can't go any farther than that. And once we've lost detail in those whites, that detail can never be recovered in post. No matter what you do, no matter how you want to play with it, if it's clipped, that detail is gone. Very bad. And we don't want to underexpose either. It might be kind of hard to see on this picture here, but there's a lot of noise in his hat and down there on the red wall and in his jacket. There's a lot of noise. That's the opposite of clipping. Clipping at the high end of the scale, we want to avoid brights becoming too white, but at the other end, we don't want to have noise in our shadows and black areas of the picture. So, what is a correct exposure? How do we define what a correct exposure is? Well, here's sort of a non-answer. A correct exposure is the exposure that achieves the effect the photographer intended. So a correct exposure, if we're shooting a dramatic piece and it's in a dark alley out in the back of a warehouse or some other situation, there are creative reasons why we might want to purposely underexpose or overexpose or something. So the correct exposure is, there's some gray area there for dramatic, but what we're going to talk about today is what is correct exposure for an interview shot or a headshot or something where we want it to look correct. Where most people would say that's a correct exposure. I don't think on some of those other examples I showed you, anybody would say that was a correct exposure on some of those pictures. So what are my criteria for correct exposure? Here's how I define what a correct exposure is, and you may agree or disagree. First of all, white should be white, but not clipped. I've said that 100 times, and I'm sure I'll say it another 100 before we're done. Blacks should be black, but not crushed. We want to still see some detail in the shadows areas of the black, a texture in somebody's shirt. We want to see some detail in it. We don't want to crush those blacks. It's not acceptable to underexpose just to be safe. Now, still photographers may do that if they're shooting raw. They may purposely underexpose a little bit, knowing that with a raw file format, they can bring that up in the Lightroom or something, and they can equalize everything out. These are not still cameras. We as video professionals are not shooting stills. We are shooting video, and it's not acceptable to underexpose just to be safe. We want to nail the exposure perfectly at the time of shooting. We want our motion blur to look normal. We don't want to shoot at a high shutter speed just because there's a lot of light. We don't want to crank our shutter speed out because that has side effects that we don't want. We also want to maintain creative control over our depth of field. If I'm shooting an interview, I want to have shallow depth of field. I want to put that background out of focus. That's why we're going to big sensor cameras like this that allow, and nice cinema lenses that allow you to put those backgrounds out of focus. But if I don't control my exposure, the camera may choose an aperture that totally erases all that trouble, all that shallow depth of field that I wanted to achieve. We also want to have our exposure be consistent from shot to shot. I talked about earlier how if we have a wide shot and a close-up shot here, we don't want with the white balance, so the white balance to change between the close-up and the wide shot. Well, same thing with exposure. If we have a wide shot here of these three people, and then I come in for a close-up of her, I want her face to look exactly the same exposure-wise also as it was on the wide shot. I don't want to have one exposure here, come in here, and now she's wearing dark colors and black and stuff, so maybe the camera, if we have it on automatic, it increases the exposure. Now suddenly her face, therefore, is brighter than it was on the wide shot. That's, again, sign of amateur. And we also don't want to have exposure fluctuations. You know, if you're shooting a guy and he's doing an interview or he's doing a presentation, he holds up a piece of white paper or he talks with his hands or something like that. I'm sure you've all seen this where the exposure will get brighter or darker. Or you'll see someone on the side of the street and a big delivery truck will drive right behind the guy and the thing goes whoop, because all of a sudden the camera saw that big white side of the truck, so it exposed down, and then when the truck went by, it came back up. Again, amateur hour. We don't want to have any of that happening. So that's why we want to control exposure. What are the exposure controls on the camera? You probably all know this already, but we'll just run through them real quick. We've got the aperture on the lens. We could roll that up and down here. Some cameras may have a dial on the side of the camera. Maybe they don't have an aperture ring on the lens itself, but same idea. Wherever you control it, every professional camera is going to have an aperture setting someplace on it. Shutter speed. We can set the camera for the shutter speed that we want to use. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second also. Gain, that's how sensitive the camera is to the light that's coming in through. You can call that gain, you can call it ISO. Those are two different terminologies that are very similar. They both refer to how sensitive the camera is to light. So that's another thing that we need to consider for our exposure. And then we've got neutral density filters. Neutral density filter, not all cameras, but most professional cameras will have some sort of a neutral density filter wheel where if we're outdoors, it's very bright, we can spin in a little bit more neutral density. It's almost like sunglasses for the camera. So you go outside, it's very bright, we roll in some ND filters and now we put on our sunglasses, now we can deal with the brightness out there. But each one of those four has side effects that need to be considered. They're just not independent things that you can just willy-nilly set them wherever you want to. Any change you make to those four is going to affect other things about the picture. Our aperture is going to affect depth of field. If we decide to shoot at f/16 versus f/2.8, there's a huge difference in what our depth of field is going to be between those two shots. Shutter speed, if we decide to shoot at 1/500th of a second, we're going to have very choppy, very staccato kind of motion that isn't going to look very good. And so we need to choose a shutter speed that's going to give us the natural flow of motion that we're used to seeing in professional videos and films. Gain, we don't want to unnecessarily raise the gain or the ISO up because that's going to introduce unwanted noise into the picture. It's going to diminish our picture quality. So we want to avoid doing that if we can. And ND filters and aperture, they kind of work together. ND filters allow us to get the aperture in the range that we want to use. For example, let's say we're outside, we're shooting, and we want to shoot at f/2.8 so we can have shallow depth of field, but it's so bright to get the right exposure, we have to dial down to f/16. Well, now we don't have the shallow depth of field that we wanted to have at f/16. So what do? We kick in a little neutral density filter, and that adds some, like putting sunglasses in front of the lens, and now everything's darker, so we can therefore roll the iris ring up a little bit, and now we're back up to f/2.8 or f/4 or something where we can get our shallow depth of field. So ND filters and aperture kind of work together side by side, but they're two separate and distinctly different exposure controls that you need to think about. As you probably would guess, I am not a fan of automatic. Why would I not like automatic exposure on the camera? We've already kind of touched on some of these already. The camera sees everything as medium gray. If you aim the camera at something bright white and put it on automatic, it's going to want to make it a medium gray. If you aim it at something black and put it on automatic, it's going to want to make it medium gray. It's going to want the cameras, for as smart as they are and all the cool things they can do, basically when it comes to white balance and exposure, automatic, they just want to kind of make everything the same, homogenize everything. So the camera doesn't know if you're shooting a white cat out in the snow or a black cat in the coal mine. You have to know what it's supposed to look like. Again, we don't want the exposure to fluctuate. We don't want the exposure to vary from shot to shot. I'm sure I've talked about those two things already enough. Automatic has no creative control over depth of field because the camera's going to choose our f-stop, not us. And as we talked about on that last slide, all the exposure changes that the camera does on automatic, whether you're letting it, and different cameras have different automatic modes. Some cameras you can say, just adjust the iris, camera. Or camera, it's okay if you adjust the shutter speed. Or camera, it's okay if you adjust the gain. Or camera, you can adjust anything you want to adjust and I'll just point the camera and shoot. But again, every one of those changes that the camera decides to make is going to have visual side effects that are almost always going to be negative. The camera's never going to choose settings that it's like, oh yeah, I like the way that looks. No, they're always going to be negative. So here we have the problem again of how are we going to judge the exposure? Well, here's some different ways that we can judge the exposure. We can use the camera's viewfinder or flip out LCD. Am I going to like that? Based on what I said about white balance? No way. That's the last way that you want to set exposure, just by looking at it and saying, yeah, that looks good to me. I like the way that looks. You can't trust your eyes. What if you've just stepped in from outdoors? What if the viewfinder on the camera isn't very good and it's dimmed down? What if it's not showing you the true brightness level? There's a million different scenarios I could point you to that where making critical judgments about exposure by just how it looks in the viewfinder will not result in good results. We could use a properly set up broadcast monitor. That's acceptable. If we have a nice monitor here that we know is set up to color bars, we know the brightness and contrast and everything is set up correctly, yeah, we can set our exposure based on that. But how often are we going to have that with us? What if we're out shooting street scenes out here in front of the store? What if we're doing run and gun stuff at a wedding or a corporate event or a documentary or something like that? We are not going to have a broadcast monitor sitting there side by side with us that's all properly set up and we're under ideal visual viewing conditions to make those kind of decisions. So if you're in an environment like right here, like we're in right now, where the lights are dimmed, we're kind of in controlled circumstances, and we had a monitor set up here, well, I could probably adjust the exposure based on how the monitor looked. I'd be comfortable with that, but that's the exception, not the rule. We can take a light meter. We can get it all set up to match the settings on the camera. We can come over to the interview. We can say, oh, f2.8, and set it to f2.8. And if you've done everything correctly, that's a great way to set exposure also. But it's a little cumbersome. It's a little bit now, how often are you going to want to carry a light meter around with you and stop and check all this stuff and everything? You can do it. I'm just saying it's probably more hassle than you want to deal with. This is my light meter and I use it for certain testing and in workshops and that kind of stuff, but I would never use this on a regular shoot out on a real paying shoot because it would just slow me down and it wouldn't give me any more information that can't be got from the camera directly, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. That offers me no advantages whatsoever. Histogram. How many people use histograms on their cameras? Still photographers use those a lot. Okay, so there's a few in here like the histogram. If you don't know what a histogram is, there's a histogram here in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And you can see as the iris is rolled up and down on the camera, you can see the picture get brighter, and you can see the histogram move. If things get brighter, it moves to the right. When things get darker, it moves to the left. And each of those columns, if you want to call that on the histogram, represents approximately how much of the picture falls into that brightness level. So here we can see there's some really bright stuff over on the right-hand side, but most of the clump is sort of at the lower end of the scale. That is of no use to me personally. Now, if you can set exposure reliably and accurately with a histogram, more power to you. I cannot. That right there tells me nothing about the exposure. Now, still photographers will use histograms. Number one, because that's really the only exposure tool they have on their camera is a histogram. And a still photographer, a professional still photographer, is shooting raw. And what they want to do is they want to make sure they're not clipping whites at the high end or crushing the blacks at the end, at the other end. They want to make sure all the data is someplace in the middle and they're not losing something on either end. But once again, we are not still photographers. That is not good enough for us just to make sure that we're playing it safe and we're not clipping at either end of the scale. So if you want to use histograms, go right ahead. If that helps you, if you've figured out a way for histograms to work for you, that's fantastic, but that's not a tool that I would use, and I'm not going to show you how to use histograms because ultimately it's not a tool that I would use myself. A waveform monitor is a much better tool than a histogram. It gives you much more precise and much better data. And a waveform monitor can come in the form of a real waveform monitor. I have one of these. That's mine, my Leader LV5350. I can bring. That's also a vector scope, so I can use it for doing color stuff also. But right now, by the display there, I can tell that it's shooting a test chart. And the waveform monitor will tell us where our exposure is, up to 100%, down to 0%. Brights are at the top, darks are at the bottom. Chances are most of you have seen a waveform monitor before. If you haven't, I'm going to skip over this because I'm not going to get bogged down in kind of how to read a waveform monitor and how to use it. But it is a very, very precise way of setting exposure. But once again, am I going to drag this around with me on run and gun stuff? Or am I going to have this at all? That's a $6,000 piece of equipment right there. How often are we going to have something like that at our disposal to set exposure? And do we even need it? A lot of cameras these days will have a built-in waveform monitor. Here on the FS7, we've replaced the histogram down in the corner with a waveform monitor. Now, this is better than the histogram because now, at least, the brightness of each of those, as you look from left to right, it represents what you're actually seeing in the rest of the picture. So I can see the bright stuff there on the right-hand side of the waveform are those flowers that are also bright on that side of the frame, the white flower there on the right-hand side. Whereas with the histogram, with the information it was showing me had no relation physically to how those values were scattered across the picture. So, but look at that waveform thing. That's built into the FS7. There's no markings on it. There's not even a line. There's a line missing around 75% or so. It is possible to set exposure using the waveform monitor, but once again, and if you can do it, great. More power to you. Whatever method you choose to set exposure, if you can do it accurately, consistently, and fast, that's what counts. I don't find that particularly useful or helpful, so I don't use that. The last exposure tool on my list there is Zebra. And people that are experienced in the business here probably knew that I was leading up to Zebra. Zebra is a very, very powerful tool for setting exposure. And as far as I know, every single professional camera and even some non-professional cameras has Zebra. And that's all I need. So what is Zebra? Anybody, just raise the hands. Anybody not know what Zebra is? Anybody have not familiar with Zebra or ever used it before? Okay, good. Zebra is a setting on the camera that is customizable, as we'll see in a second. You can customize the Zebra level, and basically it's like a red line on a VU meter, on an audio meter, where when the zebras show up, that's like hitting into the red zone of your exposure. But you can set that zone, unlike an audio meter where red is always going to be at a certain level, we can set our zebras to tell us when our exposure has hit a certain threshold. So in the case of these boats, we can see that we've got Zebra on the brightest white parts of that painted wood, and the stripes there that's the Zebra signal, that's the Zebra pattern that we're looking for. And it's called Zebra because it's stripes. Someone thought that looked like a zebra, so that's where the name comes from. It's because it's a striped pattern. Different cameras will have a different kind of a stripes to it, but it's always going to be a striped pattern. So that's what zebras might look like on something bright white. And zebras would look like this maybe on somebody's face. How many people use zebras to set exposure on faces? All right, I'm going to try and talk you out of that. Zebras on faces is not a great idea, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. But you can set zebras on that first shot with the fishing boats. Zebras were set way up to a high level, like maybe 100%. If we have zebras showing up on her face, it's probably more like a 70% zebra or so. So a couple of different ways of customizing the zebras. And as I said already, zebra is my preferred tool for setting exposure. And once you've learned to use it on one camera, it's universal. You can use the same basic techniques and way of using it on every other camera. So it's a skill worth using that isn't necessarily camera specific. So the actual zebra settings we'll talk about in a minute might be camera specific, but the way you use zebras is universal. So it's a good skill to learn. Things I like about zebra is it requires no special equipment. I don't have to have a waveform monitor. I don't have to have a broadcast monitor. I don't have to have a light meter. I don't have to have anything else because the zebra equipment is already built into the camera. So nothing extra to drag around with me. It's extremely accurate. Extremely accurate. I can set the zebras and it will be right on the money every time. So if I want to nail exposure perfectly, and I'm going to show you how to do that, you can hit that point every time. And if you don't hit that point, it's operator error in many cases, which I'm guilty of myself. I'm not perfect. I know it's hard to believe. Zebras are super easy to understand. It's not like a waveform monitor. You've got to sit there and analyze it and say, or a vector or a histogram and look at it and say, well, there's some bright spots there, but is that okay? You don't have to sit there and analyze it and look at it. Zebras immediately, I can look at a camera and say, yep, those zebras are right. Yep, exposure is good to go, roll. Customizable. The zebras need to be set at different levels for different cameras, for different shooting styles, for different scene files or picture profiles. So zebras need to be customizable because the zebra level that you use will vary. And we'll talk about how that varies and how you know what level to use in just a second. And they're the fastest way to set exposure on the fly. If you're doing a run and gun documentary thing, you've got the camera on your shoulder, using zebras is super fast. You don't need to stop and look at a waveform and adjust this and adjust that. You can hit it on the fly really easy once you get a little bit of practice with zebras and you know what to look for. So on the FS7, if we went into the menu system here, we'd find a menu that's for zebra. And on this particular camera, there's two different types of zebra, Zebra 1 and Zebra 2. I'm not going to get in today to what the differences are between those two zebras, but just be aware that if you have a camera like this that offers two types of zebras, those are different types of zebras that must be used differently. In this case, we're just going to talk about Zebra 2 because it's the more simple and it's the one that I prefer using myself. But we're not going to talk about zebra, the differences. And the cameras you may use may only have one type of zebra. But as we can see here on this camera, right now as it's set, Zebra 2 is set for 92%. So what that means is that if we adjust the iris and we start to increase the exposure, it's coming up, the zebra lines that we saw before, remember those lines on those boats, are going to come on at 92%. They're going to tell us when that bright white painted part of the boat hits 92%. So that's what that number means, is where is that threshold going to come? If you're using zebras on faces, as some people in here do, they probably would have their zebras set more around 70% or something for a Caucasian face. And other people might have their zebras set clear up to 100%. Maybe all they want to know is right when that video is going to start clipping. They just want to make sure that they're just below clipping. 92% on this camera is what I would use for the settings that I have right now. And I'll talk in a minute about why that is and how I arrived at that number. So you're probably wondering, well, why 92%? We'll cover that. Because what is the best setting for zebra? Well, as I just said, some people might say 70, some people might say 92, some people might say 100. We don't know. We'll come to that in a second. But let's get this out of the way here for a second. Skin tone is not a reliable indicator of exposure. If you're setting exposure based with zebras on somebody's face, that is not a reliable way to set the exposure. Why is that? Because everybody has different colors of skin. We're not all the same race. Some of us are tanned, some of us spent all winter indoors, some of us, come from different parts of the world. So there's no consistency to the skin tone. Let's look at those examples there. If I said I'm going to set my exposure based on 70%, that 70% number can't be right for all three of those because they're all different faces. And so when I question people about this, say, well, how can you use zebra? Well, I know that she on the right is a little bit darker, so I adjust for that. Or I know that her in the middle, she's a little bit lighter than the other woman, so I adjust for that. Well, that's guessing then. I don't even need zebras if I'm just going to start guessing based on how I interpret people's skin tones. And I shoot a lot of people that aren't Caucasian, so I don't want to have some arbitrary number say, well, for your average white person, it's 70%. A lot of the people I shoot are not your average Caucasian, so I want something that's going to be more precise than that. The only reliable way to judge exposure is with an object of known reflectance value, and that is not somebody's face. So what are objects of known reflectance value? Well, probably everybody has heard of an 18% gray card. Photographers have used those for a million years, and 18% gray card. And also you don't hear so much about a 90% white card. Well, those are two, and both of those cards are here in the kit. But Kodak has great gray cards. There's many different brands of gray cards. And white is also, I use a white card here in the examples. But white is white, let's be honest. If I have a piece of white typing paper here versus the white card here in this kit, they're both basically about the same luminance. As long as we're talking about a bright reflected white, it doesn't really matter what it is. I just find that using the cards for my interview shots and stuff to be easier than trying to scrounge up a piece of paper every time. So, gray is not really good to use though. Photographers like to use it, but it's not really good for us as video people because if we're going to use zebras to set exposure, and I hopefully have made the case why other ways of setting the exposure are not ideal, but zebras, if we're going to use zebras, most cameras don't allow you to set the zebras down low enough that you can set your exposure based on a gray card. If I was using a gray card to set exposure, I'd probably need to be able to dial my zebras down around 50% or lower than that, and most cameras won't let you set the zebras that low. So gray card is pretty much out. We want to talk about using white as our indicator for exposure. So we don't want faces because everybody's face is different. We don't want gray because it's too dark and it's difficult to use. We want white, and white is found all around us, all over, as we'll see in a minute. So we're going to meter with, so the camera here is not doing white balance. The camera here is doing exposure. The light coming down from the sun or the light or the LED light or the tungsten light, whatever it is that's coming down, it's hitting that card and it's reflecting back to the camera. The camera just needs to know. So the face is no good. We want to go by the white card there. The camera just needs to know, okay, if that's white, here's the exposure that we want. So what's happening there is not white balance, exposure. If I'm setting up an interview and there isn't something already white in the shot, like maybe if it's a doctor wearing a white lab coat, that's good enough. If it's a guy wearing someone wearing a white shirt with a nice white collar, that's also a good white target. But in this shot here, those aren't her cuffs and her stuff. Those aren't white. Those are off-white. Those are not a bright white. You can tell there's a difference between the card and her clothing right there. So if there's not something white in an interview shot, I will bring in the white card, have them hold that up, and I will set my exposure based on putting zebras on the card. And I'm done. I don't have to sit there and wonder, a little bit brighter. What do you think, Jim? A little bit, yeah, okay, I think that looks good. Yeah, okay. No, if I take a white card or a white piece of paper, it doesn't have to be the white card again. If I hold that there and I set my zebras on that white card, I know I've nailed the exposure perfectly just like that. But it doesn't have to be a white card. Any kind of reflected white will work. Those bright white clouds, I would set my zebras by the whitest parts of those clouds. White is all over the place. Almost, you'd be surprised when you start to notice it, how many shots that you do have white in them someplace. It could be a white car, it could be a white street sign, it could be white papers on a person's desk, it could be all kinds of different things. White is all over the place. It could be a white ball cap or a white uniform or something. White is all over the place, and as long as that's a nice, bright, reflected white, you can generally rely on that to set your exposure with. So white clouds, I could set my zebras on those white clouds. If I was shooting a sailboat here, where would I look for zebras for? Well, I'd look at the brightest part of the sail. That's a reflected bright white right there. I wouldn't look in the shadowy parts of the sail, and if the sun was behind the sails, I wouldn't necessarily go for those either. So, there are going to be times when you're not going to have something bright white, and that's when your kind of guessing maybe comes into play. But I'm talking about the other 99% of the time when you've got an opportunity to look for something that's bright white in the shot and use that as your indicator. So if I was shooting the sailboat, I'd want to see just some zebras on that whole long piece of the sail coming down where the red circle is there, a yellow circle. I'd want to see zebras throughout that, just that brightest white strip right there. Or on this boat here, I wouldn't set my zebras based on the white that's down by the water on the shadowy side of the boat. Look at the part there just behind the cabin where the sun's hitting the hardest. That's where I would want to see my zebras, on that white there. So you have to train your eyes in shots like this to look for where is that white that I can count on to set my exposure. How about this one? The light, that's not a reflected white. So we would not want to set zebras on that headlight on the train, because if you set your zebras on there, you're going to be way underexposing. If you could even set your zebras on there, because it might be so bright, even if you irised all the way down, you'd immediately know that, oh, this looks too dark, what's wrong? Well, what's wrong is that headlight on the train is not a reflected white. So don't be fooled by sparkles on water, specular highlights on chrome, sun glinting off the hood of a car, those kind of things. You want to look for bright, reflected whites. So in this particular case, I wouldn't go by that. I would go probably for his hoodie. It's not completely white, but it's kind of close enough to kind of get me in the ballpark. If I'm doing a run and gun thing and I set my exposure on his hoodie, I'm going to do better than the camera's going to do on its own, because the camera's going to take one look at that bright headlight and really iris down. And so even if I don't really have a good, and maybe the tank car there in the background, that's pretty bright also. So there's a little bit of experience that you have to apply into here. As you get more comfortable with your camera and using zebras, you'll get better at knowing, when you got to fudge it a little bit here and there. And I know I'm not as I've said, don't use faces because you're guessing. Well, sometimes you're still going to end up guessing if you have to. The key is to trust your instruments. Don't guess at the exposure. Don't say, that person's a little bit darker than the last person, so I'll adjust the exposure. Don't say, that looks good to me in the viewfinder. Trust your instruments. And in this case, it could be zebras. It could be histogram if you're familiar, it could be waveform monitor. It could be histogram, or it could be zebras. But just learn to trust your instruments and not go by what your eyeball is telling you, because your eyeball will fool you. So guessing at exposure, even if you hit it right sometimes, is still not the most professional way to work. And it's not consistent. You don't want to have to fix things in post. So what is the best setting for zebra? Well, as I kind of said earlier, that depends on a couple of different factors. And I can't tell you what the best setting for zebra is, because I don't know what camera you have. I don't know what controls you've set, how you've set up that camera with your paint menu controls. Now, every professional camera has a certain number of paint settings, we call them. Sometimes the menu might even be called paint menus, where you can choose your gamma mode, you can set your black levels, you can set your color saturation, you can set a lot of different parameters about the picture. Sometimes these are already built into a camera as a scene file or a picture profile, or you can go in and create your own. But those are all different. I have a number of scene files on this camera that I use, but each one of those scene files, I have to choose a different setting for that zebra menu we looked before. 92% works for the settings I'm using right now, but on some of the other settings that I use on the camera, it might need to be as low as 60% or as high as 95%. So this is the part where you have to go back and you have to do your own homework to figure out what zebra level is going to work for your camera with the settings that you're using on your camera. So here's, I think, maybe 7 steps. You only have to do this once unless you change settings on the camera. And once you do this, then you can reliably use zebra out in the field anytime you want to. But you have to do this step first. Because if I told you use zebra at 92%, that could be totally wrong for your camera. So you can't trust a number that somebody throws out to you. So make sure that the camera, so step 1, make sure that the camera is set up for the picture profile or scene file settings that you're actually going to shoot with. And if you change those, if you change the settings on step number 1, you have to repeat the other settings for that, for the other scene files. Now set up a nicely lit, step 2, set up a nicely lit shot that includes a white card or a piece of bright white typing paper, or even an index card can work good for this also, as long as it's bright white. Now, a nicely lit shot could be, if you've got a volunteer that'll sit still enough for you, set up a shot, light up a nice interview shot, get a nice shot of the person's face and set that up. If you don't have somebody that's willing to help you out with this, set up a tabletop display. This is how I usually do it when I get a new camera and I want to start setting up my zebras on it. I'll set up a nice tabletop display with maybe some fruits and vegetables, maybe some artificial flowers, stuff of a variety of brightnesses. But I want to make sure that I have a white card someplace in that shot so I can use that as my reference. So someone's face with a white card held up near it, or a tabletop, either one will work. Now you've got to have a monitor that you trust. So we all have monitors that we use either in where we edit, or maybe even your home TV. Maybe you watch TV enough in there, you know what a good picture should look like. This is the one time when I'm going to tell you it's okay to judge a picture based on what you see on the monitor. You need ideal viewing conditions. You don't want to have a lot of sun streaming in through the windows or anything. You don't want to have just come in from outdoors. You want to have a nice, comfortable viewing place. But connect a monitor that you trust and you know what a good picture is supposed to look like on that monitor. So we're going to connect the camera. Let's say this is our monitor. We're going to connect the camera to the monitor. And now we're going to adjust the f-stop on the tabletop or the shot we're doing over here of somebody. And we're going to look at the monitor and we're going to set the exposure so it looks perfect to our eye. If we open up the iris a little bit more, it's too bright. If we lower it down, it's too dark. We're going to find that nice sweet spot, just like with focus. Stuff's either in focus or it's not in focus. We're going to find what we kind of feel like that's the perfect spot. And if you've got somebody else with you, it helps to have a second set of eyes say, yeah, that looks like a nicely exposed shot. I would accept that. We'll go with that. So then you want to go to the camera zebra menu. You might have to look up in the manual if you're not familiar with what that is. Push the menu button, go to the zebra menu, and you're going to look at that white card. Let's say you've got the white card here. You can just rest it in your lap if you want to, but I've aimed that. I would have her hold that up there in front of her face, and I would adjust that. Remember how we looked at that menu before where we had the slider where we could adjust the zebra from 92% to whatever we want? While we've got that camera aimed at her with the nice, perfectly exposed shot on our monitor, we're going to adjust the menu on the zebra. We're going to start at 50 or whatever the lowest setting is. And we're going to bring up we're going to do the zebra. We're going to do the zebra menu, 55, 60, 65, 75, 85, 86, 87, 91. Ooh, we got a lot of zebras on the card at that point. And I can't show you zebras on the monitors here because zebras can generally only be seen in the viewfinder. So don't look for zebras on your monitor over here. They're not going to come out of the camera. You're going to have to look at the viewfinder here to see your zebras. So set your exposure so it looks good based on the monitor, but then when you're looking at the zebras, you're going to have to look through your viewfinder. And if this was a real thing, I would adjust the zebra menu up, 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 up. Oh, and I see the zebras starting to fill that card that she's holding up near her face. And let's say, just hypothetically, it's at 90%. At 90%, we have full zebras on the card. So we'd exit the menus and we'd lock in 90%. And that would be the zebra setting that we would want to use with that camera with those paint settings in gamma mode. So now, after you've done that, now go shoot some B-roll. Go shoot some other stuff and use the white card as your reference. You know, go around your office or your home or outside or something, set up a white reference card, aim the camera, set up your shot, put the card in there, set zebras so they fill that white card. Just barely fill the white card. You know, that's the way you want to do it. You want to just crank it up so there's tons of zebras on it. You want the zebras just to barely fill most of the card and not any further. Go out and shoot some test footage. Come back, bring it into your editor, and evaluate it. Say, are these exposures looking good to me? And if they are, then you've got the zebra setting. And now you can use 90% on your zebras from that point out, or whatever other number you came up with. If consistently it seems like things are a little underexposed, a little overexposed, then try a different zebra setting. Instead of 90, maybe go to 92 or 88 or something like that. And find that sweet spot where, with your camera, your settings, you can reliably expose on clouds, on side of a sailboat, on whatever white, bright white you see. You can set your zebras based on that. It sounds a little tricky at first here, but really it's only going to take you a few minutes to set it up. And once you've done that, once you've determined what zebra setting works the best for you and your camera, not for you, but for your camera, then you can lock it in and you don't have to repeat any of this stuff ever again unless you change settings on the camera. So it's a one-time thing. So let's say that we've decided that 92% is the correct zebra level to use on the camera. So now we've actually so now we know how we're going to measure the zebra, how we're going to measure the exposure, how we're going to determine what the correct exposure is, but now how do we physically set the exposure? Let's talk about those 4 controls that we talked about before. First of all, we want to make sure that our shutter speed is set correctly. And the video camera has a very narrow range of shutter speeds that look correct to the average viewer. A still photographer, again, this is different for a still photographer because a still photographer can snap a picture at 1/500th of a second or 1/10,000th of a second, and unless it's, you know, in most instances, you can't tell what the shutter speed was because you're only capturing 1 frame at a time. But video, we're capturing 30 frames per second or maybe 24 frames per second, and those frames have to have a certain motion blur associated with them to have smooth motion. Otherwise, if your shutter speed's too fast, you get a really choppy kind of motion, kind of feel. Even if you're shooting me standing here talking with my hands like this, or an interview, if your shutter speed is too high, you will see the hands doing weird things. Or moving things in the background. I see it all the time on news, even network level news, where the shutter speed is not correct. It's too choppy. Or you can go to the other end and have motion that's too blurry because the shutter speed's too slow. But generally, the problem that you see with video people is that the shutter speed is too high. So what is too high? Well, it depends on what we're shooting. 23.98p, that's just a more technical way of saying 24p. 29.97, that's just another more technical way of saying 30p. Those are the shutter speeds that conventional wisdom would say these are the shutter speeds that you should use for that frame rate that you're shooting at. So let's say we're shooting at 30p, a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second is where we would want to be. And there'd be almost no reason why you would want to go much higher than that. 1/100th, no matter what you're doing there, 1/100th would be the fastest shutter speed that you would ever want to shoot at with a video camera, unless you're doing some sort of specialized slow motion or something like that. Then shutter speeds can go way high if you're doing some sort of special effect thing. But if we're talking about just regular, day-to-day, regular video shooting, 1/100th is the absolute speed limit. You go any higher than that, and I guarantee you that I can tell, and other people that are watching it, they just know that something's not right. The motion does not look correct. So just keep your shutter speed at 1/60th if you can. And if you need to raise, if you want to raise it up a little bit higher, do not go above 1/100th. So we're going to set the correct shutter speed, and that barely ever changes. We do not adjust the shutter speed for exposure in video. Still photographers do. We are not still photographers. We do not adjust the shutter speed for exposure. Then I'm going to want to go to the camera. I'm going to want to choose the lowest gain, 0 dB, or the lowest ISO if you want to call, if your camera has ISO for your camera. We want that to be on the lowest setting. The lowest setting will guarantee that we're getting the cleanest, least noisy images that we can. The only time that we would want to raise that up is if we've done everything else we can with, the only time we'd want to raise that up the gain is if we've done everything else we can with the iris and the exposure and the iris and the lighting and everything, and we still don't have enough light. Then you can start to bring in the gain. And gain is electronically amplifying the image. And as you can well imagine, anytime you start electronically amplifying something, you're introducing negative side effects in the form of gain in this case. So 0, only raise it up if you absolutely cannot get the exposure that you need with all the other controls that we're talking about. So if we're outside in bright light, we might want to throw in a neutral density filter because it's so bright outside. If we're indoors, very rarely would you ever need to use a neutral density filter, but it does happen if you have a camera that's very sensitive to light. But that's a rarity. Usually that's an outdoor thing. So choose a neutral density filter if you need to. And then finally, all you have to do is choose the correct f-stop using zebras as your guide. So if we're looking at a white card on an interview situation or clouds in the sky or whatever, 99.9% of all of our exposure changes are going to be with the iris on the iris on the lens. We don't change shutter. If it's bright out, we don't raise the shutter speed up. We put in ND filters or we iris down if necessary. We don't if it's, can't emphasize enough that the iris is really the only exposure tool, of course neutral density filters to put your iris in the range that you want to use, that you need to worry about. And then you can start shooting. That's all there is to that. And thank you for coming out.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.